Okay, so you sent over this really interesting collection of stuff. And
Yeah.
it's all about thematic analysis, right?
Yeah.
And for our listeners who might not be super familiar with that term, thematic analysis is this really crucial method that researchers use, especially in areas like psychology, education, and really any field where you're dealing with a lot of qualitative data.
Yeah, you got it.
It's all about trying to find those recurring patterns, those themes that run through all that information.
Absolutely.
And so today, our mission is to really unpack thematic analysis.
Yeah.
What are its core principles? How does it actually work in practice? And why should anyone care?
Right.
We've got 3 sources to dive into. And the first one is this really foundational paper from 2006 by Braun and Clarke called Using Thematic Analysis in Psychology.
Got it.
They make a strong case for thematic analysis being super accessible and flexible, which I know is something you're always interested in.
Yeah, absolutely.
They give us their definition, which we'll get to in a second. But they also really break down how it sits in with other qualitative methods.
Right.
And crucially, they lay out these guidelines for actually doing it, like step by step. And they even talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of thematic analysis.
Right.
So like a really great overview, which is where we want to start.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, Braun and Clarke basically define thematic analysis as this method for finding, analyzing, and reporting patterns or themes within data.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And one thing that I found really interesting that they point out is that this can be used no matter what your theoretical perspective is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not tied to any one specific school of thought, so which makes it really versatile.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's actually one of the big strengths that they point out.
Okay.
Is this flexibility. So unlike some other qualitative methods that, are very grounded in a particular theoretical framework, thematic analysis can be used whether you, as the researcher, believe that those themes that you're finding reflect some objective reality out there in the world, or whether they're more shaped by your own interpretations, by the social context, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so that means for you, as someone who's looking at research, you're going to see thematic analysis applied to all sorts of different studies with very different kinds of research questions being asked.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of approach.
Exactly.
It really can be molded to different research questions, different kinds of data.
Yeah, for sure.
And what I also appreciate about Braun and Clarke is that they don't just leave it at the definition. They actually get into the nitty-gritty of how thematic analysis is done.
Yeah.
It's not just about, vaguely looking for things that pop out at you.
Right, exactly.
They emphasize the importance of really immersing yourself in the data, like reading it, rereading it, getting a feel for what's being said, spending time with it.
Yeah.
And then comes the coding part, which is essentially where you break the data down into these smaller chunks and start attaching labels to them.
Yeah, so you're kind of categorizing those chunks in a way that helps you see those patterns.
Exactly. And they lay out this 6-phase process.
Right.
But they also make it clear that this isn't like a rigid checklist.
Okay.
It's not like you just go through step 1, step 2, step 3, and you're done. It's actually more of a back and forth process, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually something they highlight as a strength.
Okay.
Because as you start coding and you start coming up with those initial themes,
Yeah.
you might realize you need to go back to the data with fresh eyes.
Right.
Maybe you need to adjust some of those codes or refine your understanding of what you thought was going on.
Right. So it's very iterative.
Very much so, yeah.
You're constantly going back and refining and making sure that your themes are really grounded in the data.
Precisely, yeah.
Now, to make this all a bit more concrete, I thought we could look at that example that Braun and Clarke talk about from a 2004 study by Frith and Gleason.
Okay.
This research was all about how men feel about their bodies and how those feelings then influence their clothing choices.
Okay, interesting.
And using thematic analysis, Frith and Gleason were able to identify all these different themes, like practical considerations, like durability, comfort, things like that.
Right.
But then also this kind of surprising lack of concern about appearance for some of the men.
Okay.
They also found themes around how clothing was used to conceal or reveal certain parts of the body.
Right.
And also how clothing helps men kind of fit into those cultural ideas of what it means to be masculine.
Interesting.
And what I think is so important here is that these themes weren't just imposed by the researchers. They really emerged from what the men themselves were saying.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that Braun and Clarke highlight, right? Is that this study actually challenges some common assumptions. about men and their relationship with appearance.
Right.
It suggests that maybe it's more complex, more strategic, less superficial than we often think.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful example of how thematic analysis can lead to these unexpected insights.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there's this other part in Braun and Clarke that I thought was super interesting.
Okay.
They touch on this debate about how we actually decide if qualitative research is good or not.
Oh, yeah.
And they mentioned that some people are worried that having these really strict rules, like super strict criteria, might actually stifle creativity and new ideas and prevent different ways of understanding things from developing.
Right. So there's this tension, right, between being rigorous and also being open to these different perspectives.
Absolutely. And it's a tricky balance to strike, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, Braun and Clarke kind of position thematic analysis as being more accessible and straightforward compared to something like discourse analysis, which they say is often seen as more of a specialized craft skill.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And they seem to be advocating for making thematic analysis more transparent, more democratic, a process that more people can engage in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which actually leads us really nicely into our second source for today.
Okay, great.
Cutting's 2019 article. And the title of this one is a bit of a mouthful.
Okay.
It's a thematic linguistic analysis of TESOL students' commitment to intercultural communication values.
All right, so we're getting very specific here.
Yeah, so this study takes those core ideas of thematic analysis and applies them to this really fascinating area, which is how future teachers, people who are training to be teachers, think about cultural differences.
Interesting.
Cutting specifically looked at journal entries written by students who were in a TESOL program.
Got it. TESOL, so teaching English to speakers of other languages?
Exactly. And these students were taking a course that was designed to get them thinking critically about all these different approaches to language and how those approaches might work or not work across cultures.
Right, right. So getting them to think beyond just like a Western-centric view of language, for example.
Exactly. And the journal entries were voluntary.
Okay.
But they provided Cutting with this really rich data set to explore these students' underlying beliefs about intercultural communication.
It's interesting that they were voluntary, though, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's worth noting that the students were specifically asked to reflect on the different concepts they were learning about in relation to cultures they were familiar with.
Okay, so it wasn't just like random thoughts?
Yeah, there was some structure there.
Right.
Now, Cutting's main question was basically, to what extent did these journal entries show that the students were actually embracing those intercultural communication values?
Yeah.
Which is really the heart of the course, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's important to note that Cutting wasn't trying to say that the course directly caused any changes.
Right.
It was more about understanding the students' perspectives as they were reflected in their journals.
Okay. Yeah, I see the distinction.
So to actually find these themes, Cutting developed these two overarching themes.
Okay.
The first one was I see orientation.
Okay. I see orientation.
Which basically meant showing a commitment to intercultural communication values.
Got it.
And the second one was non-IC orientation.
Okay.
Which indicated a lack of that commitment.
So two sides of the same coin, in a way.
Exactly. And then within each of those themes, Cutting identified these more specific sub-themes.
Okay.
So under IC orientation, some of the sub-themes were things like decentering.
Okay.
Which is basically being able to see your own culture as one among many, not the center of everything.
Right.
Then there was critically evaluating own other culture, accepting other culture, and seeing culture as being this complex thing.
Okay, so really embracing that idea of cultural relativity.
Yeah.
Right. And what about non-IC orientation?
So under non-IC orientation for you, Cutting looked at different kinds of stereotyping.
Okay.
There was positive stereotyping, polarization, which is when you exaggerate the differences between cultures, implied negative stereotyping, and overt negative stereotyping.
So a whole spectrum of ways that people might not be fully embracing those intercultural communication values.
Exactly. And I think this structured approach is really helpful for you, our listeners, to see, because it shows how thematic analysis can be tailored to answer very specific questions by creating these targeted categories to look for in the data.
It's not just a free-for-all.
No, it's very systematic.
Okay.
Now, what I find especially insightful about Cutting's work is the linguistic part
Yes.
of their thematic analysis.
Right.
So it wasn't just about what the students were saying in their journals, but also how they were using language itself.
Okay, so like looking at the actual words and phrases they used?
Exactly. And Cutting looked at these things called stance markers.
Stance markers.
Which are basically words or phrases that reveal the writer's attitude or how certain they are about something.
So like, are they hedgy? Are they being very assertive? Those sorts of things.
Exactly. So they were looking for expressions of positive and negative feelings, but also for markers of weak or strong certainty.
So how confident they sounded in their statements.
Yes. And this adds this whole other layer to the analysis, right?
I see that.
Because you can start to understand those underlying beliefs and commitments that might not be explicitly stated.
It's like reading between the lines, but in a more systematic way.
Exactly. So what were some of the key things that Cutting actually found?
Okay, so Cutting found that overall, most of the students did show at least some IC orientation, particularly in their ability to, see things from another cultural perspective to kind of decenter their own viewpoint. However, a significant number of entries also contained instances of polarization and negative stereotyping.
So those non-IC orientation sub-themes were still present.
Yeah, and interestingly, positive language was mainly used when they were talking about their own cultures.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the way they used those markers of certainty alongside these themes gave further clues about how strongly they held those intercultural communication values, or where they might have been less sure.
So you can really start to see the nuances and the complexities of people's views.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to our final source for today. And this one really focuses on how researchers can make sure thematic analysis is done rigorously.
Okay, yeah, rigor is so important.
It's Noel et al. 2017 article, Thematic Analysis, Striving to Meet the Trustworthiness Criteria.
Trustworthiness. So it's about making sure that you, as the reader of the research, can trust the findings.
Exactly. Noel and colleagues really get into the nitty-gritty of how to make sure that thematic analysis is done in a way that's systematic, transparent, and leads to findings that you can actually trust.
Because in qualitative research, the researcher is so involved in the process, right?
Absolutely. It's not like a detached, objective kind of thing.
Right.
So it's really important to have ways of showing that the analysis was done carefully and that the conclusions are grounded in the data.
Yeah, so you can have confidence in the results.
And this really speaks to something I know you, our listener, are always interested in.
Yeah.
Which is understanding how research is done.
Right.
Noel et al.
Yeah.
Acknowledge that qualitative research can be complex.
Absolutely.
And their goal is to give you this practical guide to make thematic analysis more traceable, more verifiable.
So you can kind of follow along and see how the researchers got from A to B.
Exactly. It's about showing the steps taken so that you can see the logic and the reasoning.
So like a recipe, almost?
Yeah, kind of, but with a lot more room for interpretation, of course.
Of course.
Now, they also talk about this really important concept of trustworthiness in qualitative research, and they draw on Lincoln and Guba's criteria, which are kind of the gold standard for evaluating qualitative research.
Got it.
And these are credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability.
So 4 big ideas.
Yeah, and credibility is basically asking, do the findings ring true? Are they believable?
Right.
Transferability is about whether those findings might apply to other contexts.
Okay.
Dependability refers to the consistency of the research process.
Got it.
And confirmability is about making sure that the findings are rooted in the data itself, not just the researcher's opinions.
So it's not just a subjective interpretation.
Yeah, there has to be that connection back to the data.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Noel et al. Talk about how the idea of an audit trail is super important for establishing trustworthiness in thematic analysis.
So what exactly is an audit trail?
It's basically a really detailed record of the whole research process.
Okay.
So it includes things like keeping all your raw data, any notes you took during data collection, transcripts of interviews, if you did any, your own reflections as the researcher, and really importantly, a record of all the decisions you made during the analysis.
So like why you chose certain codes, how you developed the themes, any changes you made along the way?
Exactly. And the idea is that this audit trail allows someone else to essentially retrace your steps and understand your reasoning.
So it increases transparency.
And accountability.
Yeah, it's about being open about the process. Now, Noel and colleagues also lay out this 6-phase process for doing thematic analysis,
Okay.
which kind of builds on what Braun and Clarke talked about,
Right.
but with a really big emphasis on trustworthiness.
Okay.
So the phases are familiarization with the data, generating those initial codes, searching for themes, reviewing themes, defining and naming themes,
Okay.
and then producing the report.
So pretty similar to Braun and Clarke. Yeah, the main difference is that for each phase, Noel et al. Talk about specific strategies for making sure your analysis is credible, transferable, dependable, and confirmable.
Got it. So it's like they're weaving in those trustworthiness criteria at every step.
Exactly. And they give really practical examples.
Like what?
Like during the coding phase, they recommend having multiple researchers code the same data
Okay.
and then comparing their results to see if there's agreement.
So it's not just one person's interpretation.
Right. And they also talk about discussing your findings with other researchers to get their perspectives and make sure you're not missing anything.
So it's about getting that outside input to challenge your thinking.
Exactly. And to illustrate how this all works in a real study,
Okay.
Noel et al.
Yeah.
Actually describe a research project that they did looking at strategic clinical networks in Alberta, Canada.
Okay, so they're using their own work as an example.
Yeah, and they talk about how they managed all their data using software like Excel and NVivo.
Yeah.
They explain how they generated their codes, which involved using some pre-existing ideas, but also letting new ideas emerge from the data.
So a mix of deductive and inductive coding.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of those team meetings.
Yeah.
And how talking to each other as researchers really helped them strengthen their analysis.
By getting those different viewpoints.
Yeah, and challenging each other's assumptions.
Right, because it's easy to get stuck in your own head when you're doing qualitative research.
Absolutely. And they also point out that this whole process is not always linear.
Okay.
You might go back and forth between the phases as your understanding of the data evolves.
So it's not a straight line.
No, it can be messy,
Yeah, research often is.
And they highlight some potential pitfalls.
Okay.
Like having themes that aren't really supported by the data.
Right.
Or having themes that are too similar to each other.
Yeah, that can happen.
And they also stress how important it is to clearly define and name your themes.
So that the story the data tells is clear.
Exactly. It's all about making sure that your themes are robust, meaningful, and accurately reflect those patterns in the data.
And that you, as the researcher, can clearly explain how you got there.
Absolutely. So to kind of wrap up our deep dive into thematic analysis, we've seen that it's this super flexible method for finding patterns in qualitative data.
Yeah.
It can be used in all sorts of different areas, from understanding how people think about their bodies to looking at how future teachers think about culture.
Right.
And we've also delved into this crucial issue of trustworthiness.
Making sure the research is rigorous and believable.
Exactly. So you, our listener, can have more confidence in the findings.
It's about giving you the tools to critically evaluate the research you come across.
Absolutely. And hopefully this has given you a much clearer picture of what thematic analysis is all about.
Yeah, and how it works in practice.
And with that, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
Given that thematic analysis is so flexible and that researchers are so involved in the process, how might different researchers looking at the same data actually come up with different, but still valid interpretations?
That's a great question.
What does that tell us about the nature of knowledge itself?
Yeah.
It's something to ponder as you encounter research that uses this really powerful qualitative method.
Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, it was a good one.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.